but I turned it on halfway through, so I hope they don't get too mad because I know that people are watching.
So you
From
typed
home.
in the words underneath.
I need to, right? That's sad. That's sad. Anyway, this one's going. All right. We're plugging along, and today, what you'll see, we'll talk about Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. We talked a little bit about it last time, and I should turn this on, because as soon as this comes up, we're good to go. It wakes up. Oh. Do it? Yeah, look at this. Aha!
Pretty see.
Yeah. I know, they keep showing me that one. I worry about who buys my screen every day, right? Have you noticed? You check who, see who buys your screen? Sometimes it's China, sometimes it's California. You're like, who's my, look, you don't think these pictures turn up on your screen by accident, do
How
you?
do you know?
How do you know what?
How do you know they're buying your screen?
Where do you see the
How do you know
source?
they're not buying your screen? The thing is that look, nobody does it for free. You think people provide these things for free? Like Google, right? So you do your Google or your Facebook, your Twitter, Twitter, right? You're paying for it through ads. And you don't know it. It's like TV, right? You watch TV and you're paying through it because everything you buy that's advertised, they're charging you. I'm a businessman. I pass through all my costs. You think I pay taxes? No. You think I pay for advertising? No. I don't pay for anything. I take profits from my consumers. Yay! That's the way business works. I'm a capitalist. I'm not a socialist or some kind of, whatever. Anyway, I'm sorry. But if you see anything that is supposed to be for free, it's not for free. Someone somehow is paying for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there, right? So even if Microsoft just wants to be kind and nice, but who do you think's feeding them the pictures? Right? Pictures, you realize pictures cost money, right? There are copyrights on all pictures. So when you get a really beautiful screenshot or shot, right? Who owns the copyright? And when it says it's from California, right? So, and usually they don't say the artist, or from China. It's amazing the amount of China stuff I get. China. So, just saying, okay, look, there's a thing called propaganda too. We've got a disinformation bureau in our government, so. I'm sorry. All right, so this is up. This feeds into what we had before. Matter of fact, I should probably go back to the last thing we were at. We had this really interesting translation, which was not and if you notice the pastor, the reading from Acts today, right? Saul was sent or went out to eradicate the way. Now, there are a few times in Acts where they actually translated the way. But every time you see teen hodos, which we see right here, every time you see teen hodos, what do you think they're talking about? He said, I am the voice of my friend. This is the King James, right? Make straight, the NIV is not much right. The way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah. Well, he was making known his thoughts. I am a tone, I'm a sound, in the lonesome place to steer straight the way of the supreme in authority. To steer straight the way. Yeah, okay, make straight the way. We've said it so many times, we hear it in the Hallelujah Chorus, we're like, or Handel's Messiah, but it's not. What Malachi was writing, or what Isaiah was writing about this, was about, okay, this is the appropriated term that teen hodos used to refer to themselves. And you say, why do they use that term? Because Malachi uses it, because Isaiah uses it, because it's in the Old Testament, and it's a very strong connotation in Hebraic thought, in Jewish thought. So we had this last one. He's making known his thoughts, I'm a tone, etc. And if you remember, he said, I am not. They said, are you the prophet? Are you the Messiah? And he said, I'm not. And then this is the quote. And we had talked about the way, and then I have this little note here that we can't lose track. This is a transition, right? That Christianity was originally a sect of Judaism. That's the reason I have the sects of Judaism, the 5 sects that were listed by Josephus. Josephus listed 3, Eusebius listed, I think, 7, but we generally know there are 5, and I'll talk about 4 of those today. But Christianity was what was called Tin Hodos, the way. And the church was not coming out of Tin Hodos to become Christians. What we call the church was integrating its Jewish origins and pagan origins of its Gentile members and its presumed Greek mystery religion origins. We like to think that those Christians were coming out of the rascally Jewish sects. They're not. They are the Jewish sect. And what they're doing is, okay, if you've ever been to a Messianic Jewish church, or you've ever been to a Jewish synagogue, or to a Shabbat, right? Our stuff looks a little bit like it, but not a whole lot like it, right? We have transitioned over time. But what do you think it'll look like at the beginning of the 1st century? Or this 1st century? It looked just like the Jewish work, the Jewish synagogue. And by the way, not just the synagogue, because we know that the early church was sacrificing. They were doing sacrifices to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. That's what it says in Acts. That's what they were doing. That's why they needed money. That's why it wasn't to feed the poor. It wasn't to feed themselves. They were sacrificing, and they believed, the early church believed, Tin Hodos believed, that they were supposed to do up to the Thanksgiving sacrifice, or to do the Thanksgiving sacrifice. And to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice, you had to go through all the sacrifices. So, that is... What's that?
Backing up. She was coming.
Oh. Anyway, the big point here is that we have a misconception. And we need to get rid of that misconception. And I think that, part of that problem, that misconception, there is nothing wrong with us reflecting. All right, I'm sorry, I'm kind of segueing a little bit back and forth here, but like, for example, the church, the Christian church in Japan looks a lot like our Lutheran Christian church here, the Lutheran Christian churches in Japan. But guess what? They use different terminology. They use different language. They don't use German. Oh, wait, we don't use German either. We use English. What's with those Lutherans using English? Why? Because we indoctrinate things. Is there anywhere in the Bible that talks about a Christmas tree? How many gifts? How many wise men? The church, even the order of the church stuff, what happens is when Christianity comes to other cultures, the Christianity doesn't change. The basic tenets and theology and ideas in it don't change. But guess what? The services, the languages, the words that are used are different. Why? Because it makes it familiar to the people, right? So, for example, if you are in an Islamic country and you are a Christian, what do you call God? Allah. If you are in Japan, you call Kami. And actually, there's another thing for the high Kami, Dekami or something like that. Anyway, but you use the terminology, and the terminology is the same terminology used in other religions because that's the language of their nation and their people. So it shouldn't astound us that, by the way, what did those rascally Gentiles do that really irritated the Jewish Christians, or the Jewish Tin Hodos? They used
some of the pagan stuff, pagan dates and festivals, yeah.
I don't think that irritated them so much, but you're right. You're absolutely correct. But the thing they did that really, and I should have my drawer up here, the thing that really did that really irritated them was that they used the symbols. Why is this a problem for the Jewish teen hodos? Why is this a problem for the Jewish teen hodos? It's an image. It's a graven image. They did not use symbols like this. A symbol was considered to be completely illegal in Jewish thought. But the Gentiles did not follow Mosaic code or law, right? They followed the Noahic code. And so they could do these things, and guess what? These are parts of our whole life, right? Our whole church life. An example of what I say right here. It's integrating the Jewish origins, the pagan origins of Gentile members, and presumed Greek mystery religion. What did Paul say? Paul kind of won on this, but, I love Paul. I wish Paul had won on everything, because we'd have lamb at our seders, but he lost. So John Chrysostom won. We get bread and wine, which is better than nothing, right? But I'm just saying, we could have had a seder with lamb. Paul won. But Paul didn't win on other aspects because we see the Mysterion ideas and other things that Paul encouraged, and taking over the festivals and taking over the stuff, right, which is really cool. And that's the way Christianity is supposed to work. Teen Hodos is not supposed to be supplanted by Halloween. It's supposed to supplant Halloween, right? That we lost our mission. Anyway, but here's a Tanakh quote from Isaiah 40. Comfort my people, says the Lord, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. I did not retranslate this from the Hebrew. Proclaim to her, forced labor has been completed. Her iniquity has been pardoned, for she has received from the hand of the Lord double for all her sins. The voice of one calling, prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness, make straight a highway for our God in the desert. Every valley should be lifted up, every mountain and hill made low, the uneven ground will become smooth, and the rugged land a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all humanity together will see it. That is the messianic promise. That is the quotation that I told you was an irony. That, if you remember, John the Immerser said, I am not. Matter of fact, he used ego eimi, ego eimi, I am not. But yet, then he quotes this, which presumes that he is the prophet. Right? Yeah. That's why it's a Greek irony. That's why, I don't know if you were a kid and this confused you and you go, but he said he wasn't. But then he quotes this, right? And most children probably get it because they do that to you. Did you know that? That's what your children do to you all the time. Daddy told me I could. Right? Daddy didn't tell you could at all. Daddy may not even said anything to you. Yes, sir.
Could you be saying that he's not Isaiah, he's not the actual prophet, but he's what was spoken, the prophet spoken of.
Right, but remember they asked him, and you're right. This is Greek thought. If this was written in Hebrew, it might have, if John was a Hebrew thinker, and he was writing in Hebrew, if they were Hebrew thinkers, they might have gone down that irrational path, right? Because it's euphemistic. But he's not, he's Greek thinker. So a Greek thinker, if you're not Isaiah, can you be Isaiah? No, it's impossible, right? And so what we have is what I would consider a figure of speech or a beautiful Greek irony. It's a Greek irony. It's something where and you see this with Christ all the time, right? Christ not so much, but more, what you do see with Christ. He will not answer the question, right? Don't you feel this way? You say, Jesus, answer the question. The disciples want to know, right? And he never does, because it's Greek. And you don't ever tell them, don't ever give them the answer, right? So anyway, this is probably one of the most beautiful examples of the Greek way of thinking, because it's purely rational. And all we're getting it's purely rational. We're going to see even more of that, because especially in the Greek itself, it's really obvious to me. This is a very simple statement right here. Now the Pharisees who had been sent, and they which were sent were of the Pharisees, and here's what it says in the Greek. And some having been set apart were out from among the Sadducees. Okay, so not a huge thing, but remember we had I think we had the priests and the Levites first, and this is where I want to talk about the 5 sects of Judaism. We have Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. We'll talk all about Teen Hodos. We already kind of went over Teen Hodos. The source of this information, I think this is from Britannia. I try to get good sources. I don't use Wikipedia. I try to pick ones that were really appropriate. Some of them might have some negative stuff, which is cool. The Sadducees from the hero Tistok, meaning high priest. So already their name means high priest. They're a religious and political movement, ancient Judaism, that existed during the Second Temple period, which is right here, time of Christ, right? You notice they were 350 B, they use those terminology, BC to AD. They don't like to use AD on the Deus because they don't acknowledge Christ, but we use those dates anyway, so I do. 70, what happened?
Destruction.
Yeah, destruction of the temple. And so, remember I told you that the Sadducees are priests. The group was founded 2nd century, it ceased to exist after the 1st century following destruction of the temple, right there. Most of what's known about Sadducees, Zakots and Tesdacum, is derived from their critics. Now their writings remain extant. We haven't found them. We may find them in the future. It's cool. However, what's the problem? Why would their writings be hard to come by, or even why they might not exist?
What describes the Pharisees, the writers with this?
Yeah, these are the priests. Now, we presume the priests knew how to read and write and were trained in it. I think they were. Remember, John the Immerser was a priest's son and probably was trained into the priesthood. But you got to realize, it's the rabbis. The rabbis are which group? Pharisees. Yeah. And these groups are large, but they're not that large. I think we said maybe 4,000 or so. Yes, sir.
Just thinking, was there a family lineage to the Pharisee side of it? Or could anybody just, if you're a really good student, you might grow up to be a Pharisee?
You know, it's the first encounter of the American dream, right? Because it didn't matter, it always matters in these societies who your mother and father were. But theoretically, a guy like Jesus or Paul was a Pharisee family. Generally, it helps to have somebody in your family who's there, right? But theoretically, you could come from, and that's what they did. You know, every little village, every little place, every big place had a rabbi, and the rabbi had a synagogue. And in a synagogue, he trained the children, the boys, to read and write, and you memorize the Torah. And by the way, what do you think? Those kids who could really memorize the Torah, right? The rabbi's on the door of Mary and Joseph or whoever and saying, hey, you know, your kid's pretty good. How about I give a letter, either he remains with me, or usually they would selectively send children. We know how this works. It works the same way today. You get a letter from your rabbi, and you go as a child, and you go, you know, when you usually, in the old days when you were 13, today they make them wait a little bit, usually till they're graduates from high school, because we don't believe that children can be adults at 13. But in the past, we know they came at 13, and they would go to the door, for example, Gamaliel, right? The rabbi of Rabbonis in Israel, in Jerusalem. And he would come to the house, and you would be greeted by a servant, not by Gamaliel, of course, and the servant would look at your letter, and usually they may or may not be able to read, but you would have memorized the letter because you were the bearer. You know, this thing that we miss, right? We think, just like today, you get a secret letter from your teacher and you give it to another teacher. Unless you brought your slave, your book slave, with you, which most of these kids didn't have, who was reading the letter? You were, because you memorized it, because that's the way it works. You didn't just give a letter to somebody and they're like, right? You memorized it, so you recited it, even to the rabbi, because it was doubtful. Yes, you can pick the words apart, but you better work really hard at it, right? We know that's the way it worked. So, you tell him, here's my letter, and the fact that he wrote it down. And maybe if you were from a really poor rabbi, he didn't even write it down. He just told you what to say. You can always check, right? Anyway, you went to the thing, you sat in the group, and the rabbi, if you were able to memorize the Tanakh and the Mishnah after maybe 10, 20 years, right? He might acknowledge you. He would feed you. If he fed you and gave you a place to sleep, you slept, in those days they just slept on the floor, right? Then you were part of the group. And he would keep you
They had
around.
a mat like we're crocheting that they could roll up.
You hope, right? We'll get to that. Yeah, we've got one of those because, yes, you hope, right? So maybe you carried it with you. But yeah, back in the old days, people just slept and did all their sleeping business in one place. But we don't like to think about that, right? Anyway, let's see. Historically reconstructed picture may not be entirely accurate. This is the Britannica. Since it's biased source indicates Sadducees reject the existence of an afterlife. Thus, they denied the Pharisaic doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. And remember, we talked about this. The Pharisees believed in the physical resurrection, not spiritual resurrection. We'll get to that. Etymology, Sadducee derives from Tzedak. And here they go a little bit off the rails, but it's okay. I want to give a full picture here. We know if you call yourself high priest, okay, Tzedak, suggesting they're followers of the teaching of the high priest Tzedak, often spelled Zodok. Thus, the Pharisees seem to be a priestly group, associated with leadership of the Temple of Jerusalem. Okay, seem. Okay, it didn't seem. These were the guys. Okay. Anyway, whenever you hear priests or Levites, these are the guys. And by the way, if you weren't in the crowd, you were nothing, right? Most of what's known come to their critics, including Josephus. You notice the guy Josephus wrote they were a quarrelsome group whose followers were wealthy and powerful, and he considered them boorish. Josephus relates nothing concerning their origin, only knows of three sects. He talks three sects: Essenes, Pharisees, Essenes, and Sadducees, dated to the ancient times, which point in time prior to John Hyrcanus, the Maccabean War, right? He implies they were a political Sanhedrin of the Sadducee collaborators with Roman rule. We know that only 4 of the members of the Sanhedrin at the time of Christ or the time of the Acts were Pharisees. So the Sanhedrin was mostly that. We're not going to go about that. Other sources critical about Sadducees come from the Talmud and the Pharisaic teachings. Remember the Talmud? We'll talk about that too. Refutations of Sadducean beliefs, the Christian New Testament. None of these writings presents the Sadducee side. Okay. It's possible the positions described in later literature are meant to be rhetorical foils, whatever their opinion of the opposite, etc. Yeah, they always say this kind of stuff. It's really cool. Remember what we know about historical writings? You always accept what is said and written unless you have something that disproves it, right? So their ideas are kind of silly, but it's okay. I don't mind them saying this because it gives us some insight into what they think and what the thinking is. Little or none of their own writings preserved because they didn't write, right? They are the priestly group, associated with leadership. They may represent the aristocratic clan of the Hasmonean high priest. And this is really important. It's what I've been telling you about, so you see it in writing here. They replaced the previous high priest lineage that allowed the Syrian emperor Antiochus to desecrate the Temple of Jerusalem with idolatrous sacrifices and to martyr monotheistic Jews. It's a simpler than that. If you remember, in the Maccabean Revolt, before the revolt, there was a guy called Jonathan the high priest. I didn't mention this in here, but did you say it? Yeah, Dead Sea Scroll. Essenes were led by a high priestly, thought to be the descendants of a legitimate high priestly lineage, which was Jonathan. The Asmoneans ousted the Dead Sea Scrolls, brutally opposed the current high priest of the temple, since they were a different priestly line. Which priestly line were they different? They were not the lineage of Aaron. Now, they may have had some of the Aaronite priests in there. John the Immerser's father, he says he was from the Aaronite line. You're not supposed to, remember, what did the Maccabees do? The Maccabees put in place a priest, high priests and priests that were not from the Aaronic line. We know this. In Maccabees 1, it's in Maccabees 2, and we know it from Josephus. So we know there was some stuff going on. It wasn't very happy. So the Essenes took their ball and walked away. We'll talk about Essenes. Essenes were a different priestly line, such as their political emphasis of their priestly lineage degree. The problem they had the same problem that Herod. What was Herod's problem?
He's an Edomite.
He's an Edomite. And so he worked really hard to hide the fact that he was an Edomite. So what did he do?
Destroyed all the records.
He destroyed all the records. Yeah.
And he married into the Herodian family, or
Yep. Well, he was, okay, I don't have my notes on this, but basically Herod was an aide de camp, a secretary to the Maccabean emperor, and was able, we don't know if he poisoned, killed, most likely, or just was given that position by the Romans, but eventually the Romans gave him that position. So he was never part of the Maccabean, or the Maccabeans basically were eradicated politically and physically, right? And left Herod. And Herod's like, oh, you want me to be the emperor or the king of all the, okay, I'll do it. Right? Yeah. He's a pretty bad guy. He's the guy who killed all the kids in Jerusalem, right? The guy who killed Jesus in Bethlehem. Going to the above-mentioned sources, Sadducees rejected certain beliefs of the Pharisaic, including the tenet of the oral Torah. This is really, really important. The oral Torah, the Mishnah, is what the Pharisees, we'll talk about when we get Pharisees. Sadducees interpret the verses of the Torah literally, which meant they had a more stringent lifestyle. However, you remember, we have that problem of the school of Gamaliel, the school of Gamaliel, and the school of Jerusalem. And the school of Gamaliel and Jerusalem were the different Pharisaic schools. Some who interpreted the law more stringently. And so, they say, rigorous today, their code was abolished by the Pharisaic Sanhedrin under Simon ben Shetaz. And what would that mean? If they went away from the literal Torah, what did they just go away from? Natural law. Just want to point that out. So our lovely Pharisees were going against natural law from the very beginning. I think it's interesting. Sadducees said to insist on literal execution of eye for an eye for a tooth for a tooth, which Pharisaic Judaism and later Rabbinic Judaism rejected. Pharisaic and Rabbinic are synonymous. On the other hand, will not inflict the death penalty on false witness in a case, etc. They have some more stuff in here. Let's keep moving. According to the Talmud, they granted the daughter a same right of inheritance, which is cool. This is neat stuff in Babylonian Talmud, etc. Did I miss that one part? There's a little part in here that talks about how they, even though the time between they accept the Talmudic and Mishnah words about the Sadducees, even though they're displaced in time by quite a bit, a couple of centuries. But I thought it was funny that Britannic wouldn't even note that, but they accept it anyway. Okay. According to the Talmud, they continue 7 weeks is head for the barley shoot, and this is part of that problem. To Shavuot, should be according to Leviticus, be counted from the day after Shabbat, and consequently, remember, I told you the Essenes had a different view of when the festival should be. The Sadducees did too, and the Pharisees did too. But guess who controlled the world at that time? The Sadducees. Yes, sir.
Now, it seems like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the Essenes I always think of being outside the wall somewhere, but these were opposing groups with certainly different beliefs. Did they share the use of the temple? Because we always read in the news, it's always the Pharisees and the it seems like they're all there. Did the Pharisees exist outside the temple, or were they in there as well, and they argued, or?
Let me see if I can draw a picture. A picture might be the best thing to do. Use my mini board there, but here's a picture. Here's the temple. What's the purpose of the temple?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Sacrifice. What's the purpose of the priests?
The intermediary.
Who are the Sadducees? So the Sadducees, temple, sacrifice. Next door, not quite next door, but close enough. Here's the synagogue. Synagogue. These are the Pharisees, the rabbis. Okay? Any sacrifice going on here? Uh-oh. What are they doing? Teaching, reading, writing, right? Talking. This is where you're going to find them. Now, why would the Pharisees go to the temple? The sacrifice. Every Jewish person, Teen Hodos, was sacrificing. All of them are sacrificing. The Essenes, they took the ball and left. Now, we're going to see what they think about the Essenes. There's interesting questions about the Essenes and what they were doing. There are also Sadducees, we know, in Alexandria. And what were they doing? They were sacrificing. Josephus said they were sacrificing. Are they supposed to be? No. And which Sadducees are they? I don't know. Remember when this happened, right? I mean, okay, I know, I'm sorry. This is all history, right? This is all the history stuff. Maybe I should write a tome on it, although no one would read it, but it's more fun to hear it. So, when they came back from Babylon, who was left in the land?
The real Jews.
The ones that couldn't prove their lineage.
Well, the ones who were in the land were those who were not the rich and famous. They were royalty, no
They had the
property, no
cleanest
royalty.
lineage.
What's that?
They had the cleanest lineage, the ones that were left.
I think the guys that were left in the thing had the cleanest lineage. They were, but they called them Samaritans. But when they came back from Babylon, they had, remember, okay, were there any babies born that had male inheritors from Jerusalem?
70 years.
Well, you hope,
The
but
males were all,
castrated. They castrated them. That's what they did. So all the males were castrated. We know that Daniel was
We know
castrated.
Daniel was.
What's that?
We know Daniel was, but
So was
maybe the three in the fiery furnace. But did they castrate everybody or just the ones from the nobility?
what would you do? This was a technique that you used when you took over a land. Okay, remember, the Assyrians failed. The Assyrians failed and everybody knew it. Okay? Don't take the people from the land, just everybody. Because what happens?
they'll take over your land.
They'll take over your land, you destroy your society and culture. Oh, borders, man. Oh, yeah, sorry, that's the other thing. Anyway, so the Assyrians lost, and so the Babylonians had this great idea. The Babylonian idea was, we're going to take the guys with money and the royalty. We'll cut the head off the serpent. So the serpent's flopping around, that's the Samaritans, right? But the Samaritans are Jewish. Guess what? All the Babylonian captives, okay, if you can find it historically, I'll go for it. But the presumption is they were all castrated.
But in Jeremiah, God tells them to prosper in the land and to have descendants and all this stuff, but that wouldn't be possible if they all were,
Except
like,
that heredity
and rather,
comes through the female.
except ready comes from the female.
But then he would be telling them to have affairs with Babylonians.
No, they have affairs, they just married. That's the way it worked. And by the way, remember, good old, the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. What did Abraham do? Abraham had a guy that was going to inherit everything if he didn't have a child, right? Right? And then he got a, what's her name? Hagar, and had a son that was not inherit, right, later. So, you know, what you did is what you did. This is the ancient world, right? And things aren't quite the way we like to think and clean this and whatever.
Obligation, Sarah's obligation to provide. If she couldn't provide a child for Abraham, she needed to provide somebody else.
Even though it's the guy's fault. But yes, you know, that's the thing is that what they had to do, they had to do. And so, okay, I'm not going to fight lineage. Maybe there was some Jewish genes running around with the Y chromosome. But the chances are, it's pretty unlikely. There could be. Okay, so maybe somebody got missed. Some of the children maybe got missed. They were, you know, allowed to reproduce. But Babylonians were well. Okay, when you think of Babylonians, do you think kindness, gentleness, and aqueducts? No, you don't. You think about, look, remember, these are guys that were, you know, Persians. Remember the Persians took over Babylon eventually and destroyed it? And how they do it? They washed away the walls and killed all the people. Remember that? Many, Trekel, whatever. So, anyway, we are talking about societies that were not, they're not like kinder and gentler societies, and they're not woke at all. Then you have the Romans. The Romans are actually really pretty kind and woke compared to the Babylonians and Persians, because their plan was to do what?
Just rule everybody.
Yeah, what they did is they cut the head off the serpent, and they put their own people in charge, and they rotated them. They're pretty smart about that. They control religion, they control the politics, and they basically put a guy that they said, like, you know, good old Pilate. If you don't do a good job, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
Without no money and no sandwiches, right? So, yeah, it works pretty good. And the Roman method was used for a long time pretty effectively, even in, serf society. The world became a serf-based socialism, so it's not a
Well,
happiness.
even modern colonialism is similar to that.
What's that?
Modern colonialism with the British would go into India or whatever, and they put in their people, but they weren't killing them and castrating them or anything like that.
Right. Well, you give them, you do what the Romans did.
Yeah.
You gave them aqueducts and railways and roads and commerce, and people are not starving anymore in the streets. And people go, oh, you know, and that worked for a while until Mahatma Gandhi, who was not all that, well, whatever. He's a peaceful, nice guy, but in any case. They were conflicted. Here's some things. I'm not sure this is great, but in regards to rituals in Jerusalem, daily burnt offerings offered by the high priest at his own expense, which is interesting. Obviously wealthy. The Pharisees contended they would be furnished by natural sacrifice at the cost of temple treasury. They held that the meal offering belonged to the priest's portion. Now, why would the Pharisees claim it for the altar? How did-
Everybody shared it.
Well, how did the priests eat?
Yes.
What do you think the Pharisees wanted to do? Starve their wealth and starve them. You know, if I could starve your wealth comes from the sacrifice, right? And so if I can starve you on the sacrifice, it's a great thing. They insist on a special high degree of purity for those officiating. That's probably good, right? The preparation of the ashes of the red heifer. There hasn't been a red heifer in Jerusalem, though, for 1,000 years. Pharisees opposed such strictness. Go to kindling of incense in a vessel which the high priest. This is interesting. They entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement was to take place outside. So he might be wrapped in smoke while meeting the Shekinah within, according to Leviticus. Whereas the Pharisees denied the high priest's claim of such supernatural vision. Very interesting. Some of this, the Sadducees don't look too bad, right? Pharisees looking worse and worse in some ways. We'll see more about Pharisees. They opposed the popular festival of the water libation. And by the way, this is what got some of them killed. Remember I told you that? One of the priests, obviously a Sadducee, did not, he appeared not to pour the water from the pool of Siloam on the altar. And when he did that, it caused a riot, and they killed him. They ripped him apart, according to Josephus. So, yeah, that probably didn't last very long. They opposed the Pharisaic assertion the scrolls of the Holy Scriptures have, like any holy vessel, the power to render originally unclean the hands that touch them. They opposed the Pharisaic idea of the eruv, the merging of several private precincts into one. These are the internal fights, which are kind of interesting to see, right? Civil documents use the phrase after the high priest of the Most High. They oppose the formula introduced by the Pharisees in divorce documents according to the law of Moses in Israel. And there's evidence that, these are little, Semitic fights, right? There's evidence that internal schism among the Sadducees. Some rejected angels and the soul and resurrection. Well, I think this is not very good. We know, what happened to the Sadducees? We know from Acts what happened to the Sadducees and the priests.
A number of them became teen hodos.
They became teen hodos. Yeah, as a matter of fact, Luke is written most likely to the high priest. Remember when I taught Luke and Theodulus is the name of one of the high priests during that period? It was probably written to him. So the thing is that a lot of the Sadducees converted, and by the way, what do you think the seminal moment for them was? Destruction of the temple, right? Destruction of the temple, and all of a sudden, that's the end of everything. Yeah, end of their business and everything. Among the rabbis, 2nd century legends, this legend circulated. Last, Simeon the Just, the last of the Great Assembly, consequently living the time and influx of Hellenistic ideas, taught the maxim, be not like the servants who serve the master for the sake of the reward, but rather like those who serve without thought of receiving a reward. Two of his disciples, Zadok and Bithos, remember Zadok is they think, the name of the thing, mistaking the high ethical report of the maxim, arrived at the conclusion that was no future retribution, saying, let someone work all day without obtaining due reward in the evening? Boy, we've heard something like that before from Jesus, right? Instantly broke away from the law and lived a great luxury, using many silver and gold vessels from the temple. They established schools that declared the enjoyment of life to the goal of man, same time pitying the Pharisees for their bitter privation in the world with no hope in another world to compensate them. These two schools were called after their founders, the Sadducees and the Boethusians. You didn't know about those guys, did they? Halabi suggests that while there's evidence the Sadducee sect from the times of Ezra, it emerged as a major force only as the Hasmonean rebellion. Reason of this is not, he claims, a matter of religion. Says, I think it's totally wrong, but Hellenists joined the Sadducees, maintaining they were rejecting not Judaism but rabbinic law. Thus, the Sadducees were, for the most part, a political party, not a religious sect.
What is the Avot 1 through 3 that is mentioned up there?
That's one of the Talmudic documents. Yeah. All right, we're going to look at some Talmudic stuff when we get to the immersion stuff. Sadducees mentioned in the Christian New Testament, Gospel of Matthew, definitely in the resurrection. We also got from the Talmud, the Sadducees claim there's no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits, while the Pharisees acknowledge all three. This is where we're going to get to in chapter 3, when we get to chapter 3. New Testament contrasts their views with the Pharisees. In the climate of Judeo-Christian polemics, characterized the church leaders, Christianity as a legitimate heir to the Hebrew Scriptures, King Hodos, right? And thus made efforts to devalue rabbinic Judaism. Wait a second. They're talking about Sadducees, and now they're trying to devalue rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is Pharisaic Judaism, which is really interesting because that doesn't fit. But that's okay. That's Britannica, right? The books of the New Testament portray the Sanhedrin as a corrupt group of Pharisees, although it was in reality primarily made up of Sadducees. There's only 4 Pharisees, and that's not exactly true. They didn't read the New Testament, obviously. Sadducees were no longer an active threat to deistic Christianity. By 70 AD, the gospel consistently make a distinction between Pharisees and the elders, the rulers of the people.
It's kind of ironic that the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, but so many of them converted to teen hodos.
I think chapter 3 may answer that question. It did for the Pharisees, or at least it did for Nicodemus. And it may have been a good argument for the priests too. And we get to the end here. This was contributors from, like I said, great, and I like this because the Great Sanhedrin, we don't get this much, but they got in here. The Grand Council, Assembly of Jewish Judges, who constituted the Supreme Court and legislative body of ancient Israel. The make of the Great Sanhedrin, including a Chief Justice, Nase, a Vice Justice, and 69 general members who all sat in the form of a semicircle when in session. Among these members were both Sadducees and Pharisees, so there were 71. It's interesting. I wonder how they fit them. But we do know that there were only 4 Pharisees at the time. So the Pharisees. I want to kind of get through all this. I don't think. Let this a little bit shorter here. Member of the Jewish party that flourished in Palestine. Pharisees' insistence on the binding force of the oral tradition, the unwritten Torah, the oral Torah, which is called the Mishnah. Basic tenet of Jewish theological thought, when the Mishnah, the first constituent part of the Talmud, was compiled about 200 CE, 200 AD. Remember I told you there's a big fight about when it was actually done. Early date people say 90, late say 200. 90 is probably more accurate. That was when the Council of Jamnia, but there are people who disagree that there was a Council of Jamnia. But in any case, they got together and they actually wrote down the oral Torah, which is the Mishnah, and then they wrote the Talmudic documents around it. So that's the important thing. I'm sorry, Tammy asked me to keep putting those on the thing, but I run out of space, so I don't put those in every note page, but it is important to note. Pharisees, Perushim, emerged as a distinct group after the Maccabean revolt. Okay, they call it Hasmonean, but it's Maccabean revolt before. They were generally spiritual descendants of the Hasmoneans. Okay, that's all right. Pharisees emerged as part of the laymen and scribes in contradiction to the Sadducees. Right? The priests are the Sadducees. These guys are laymen and scribes. But the most important thing is these are the rabbis. These guys teach in the synagogues. Part of the high priesthood that traditionally provided the sole leadership of the Jewish people. Now, why do you think, okay, you can be early date or late date on synagogues and rabbinic stuff. Why did these guys suddenly come into vogue? What do you think pushed this? I'm early date. So I think it was our buddy Jehoshaphat. Was it Jehoshaphat? Is that the right guy? Where they found the scrolls, remember the temple? Was that? Josiah. Oh, Joseph. Josiah. So Josiah. Remember, he found the scrolls, and what did he say? We're going to read them to the people, right? So then what did they do? Make copies. It's a big deal to make copies. So where I think that was, Josiah was the beginning of the rabbinic class, the Pharisaic groups. They may not have been Pharisees at the beginning, but the big deal was their whole purpose was scribes, copying, and teaching. So that was the synagogue, beginning of the synagogue process.
Just a question. The New Testament writers, would they have used a Pharisee to write their letters?
No, we use a Libraeus.
Oh, that's something
Libraeus,
okay.
yeah. Because now I would argue that probably the Pharisees all knew Greek. Whether they wrote it or not, or claimed to write it or not, I would probably say no. They probably, okay, this is a class-based society, right? So where is the Secretary of Libraeus on the class of the society?
Pretty high.
Well, he's high for the middle class, like making bucks, right? But he can read and write, so he's there. But where is he compared to a rabbi or a Pharisee, or even a Sadducee? Yeah, low, we could say upper middle class, right? Something like upper middle class. These guys are wealthy dudes. And so, is a rabbi going to be writing his own stuff? No. Matter of fact, who's writing this stuff for him? Well, his little interns probably. They wouldn't let a slave write that. No, you didn't let a slave. But a Libraeus, Libraeus could have been a slave. But a Libraeus was probably just, if you can find a slave Libraeus, boy, you pick him up, right? Because that would be, like, wonderful. Matter of fact, who was a slave Libraeus? Plato. Plato, remember? Back to all that stuff they taught you about Greek, classical Greek. Plato was a book slave. He was a Libraeus. That's what he did for a living. And then he kind of broke away. He paid off his freedom and became a free man. So, anyway, they would have probably hired a guy because Libraeus was a specific guy to do that. Macmabial differences between Sadducees' attitudes toward the Torah. It's more than the Torah. It's the oral Torah, right? The problem of finding answers to questions, based decisions about legal and religious matters. Okay, if you brought a problem to the Sadducee, what would he say? Read the Torah. You brought it to the rabbi, the Pharisee, he would say, let me see what the Mishnah and Talmud say too. Interesting, right?
But isn't it similar to we read our Bible and it's got all the footnotes and all the notes on the side of it? Isn't that similar?
And Scofield Ready Mix. Actually, it's not similar at all. The way it worked is this. You have the Torah, which is the written Torah. Then you have the Mishnah that was not written until, I'd say 90, but okay, 200 AD. They wrote it down, and then around it you have the commentary on it. So, for example, the Torah says, I'm going to make it up stuff, okay? Don't hold me to this, but I'm making it up. The Torah says, thou shalt not kill. And then it gives you a whole bunch of stuff about what is murder, and et cetera, et cetera. The Mishnah may say, thou shalt not kill, and in addition to cases that were given to Moses, were the case of somebody that was hit by a hoe, and they weren't sure if it was totally accidental, but they ruled it was an accident. Okay? And then you have the Talmudic commentary. The Talmudic commentary would say, based on this, to establish the guilt of a person for manslaughter, you need to do this, this, and this. So it's not like the Scofield Ready Mix on the side, Scofield Ready Mix, right? On the side of your Bible. What it is it's commentary on the text that were legally binding. To the point, for example, it says, thou shalt not travel on the Shabbat, right? The Mishnah says you cannot travel on Shabbat except within a place that is encircled by a courtyard. The Talmud says, and this is true, and I don't have the quotes exactly where it is, but it's in the Talmud. The Talmud says any place that is ringed by a rope is a courtyard. And therefore, in Jerusalem, in the Roman times, in the time of Christ, they put a rope all the way around Jerusalem, which meant they could travel anywhere in Jerusalem on Shabbat.
They probably had to.
It's just a bunch of loopholes.
That's why Jesus wasn't too happy with it. Right?
Lots of rules about the rules about the rules.
The rules about the rules about the rules, yes. Rather blindly follow the letter of the law if it conflicted with reason or conscience. Conflict with the reason or... Okay. This is modern wokeism here, right? Because the law is a law. But if it conflicts with my thinking, right, or what I feel, I'm going to harmonize with my own ideas. I found their own ideas to suggest or imply it. Okay. The law is a law. They interpret the law according to its spirit. Ooh, I call it the evangelical heresy. There are real problems with doing that. If you think that you can interpret with your... There's a woman who claims that she preaches Jesus by stripping. The Spirit told her. Why not? It's a Pharisaic idea right there. When in the course of time, law had been outgrown or superseded by changing conditions, they gave it a new and more... This is like constitutionalists versus unconstitutionalists, right? The living Constitution versus the Constitution. We got them all over the place, right? You can imagine why Jesus was so irritated. Just saying. Hermetics, whatever, the progressive tendency of the Pharisees, that their interpretation of the Torah continued to develop until, when did it stop? Not 14th century. Completely stopped. I don't know if the French destroyed it for them. The last entries are in French in the Talmud. So, it stopped it. I don't know if they still argue about it today, probably, but whatever. Let's see. Primary political party. In the New Testament, they appear as spokesman for the majority of the population, about 108 BC, 108 before Christ. A long struggle inside. They tried to democratize the Jewish religion, remove it from the control of the temple priests. Therefore, cut the priests off. The Pharisees asserted God could and should be worshipped even away from the temple and outside Jerusalem. Alexandria, yes, sir.
So if you've got the rabbis kind of here, there, and everywhere, and you've got the Sadducees centered in the temple, what did the general population, it seems you've got conflicting laws, interpretation of the laws, and all this kind of stuff. Or did most people just kind of do their thing, do the sacrifice, and
Every male is trained by a Pharisee rabbi and learned to read the Torah or memorize the Torah. Therefore, the hand, they're not rocks the cradle, the hand that controls the education system controls the world.
Indoctrination.
As it still is.
Yep. So you ever wondered how to take over a nation? The rabbis had it right on, and the Sadducees were a little stupid. They should have been monitoring who was educating. Because who is educating and what they're educating is what's going to be. And by the way, what do you have now in Judaism? It's Rabbinic Judaism, which is Pharisee in large measure, not quite. They've broken into three groups, but that's a whole other thing. Let's see. And by the way, this is why they survived. To the Pharisees, worship consisted not in bloody sacrifice, the practice of the temple priests, but in prayer and the study of God's law. So even after the destruction of the temple, you can do that. And that's why Pharisee Judaism basically survived afterwards. The synagogue may thus be considered a Pharisaic institution since Pharisees developed it, raised it to high eminence, and gave it a central place in Jewish life. I believe early, back in the time of Israel before they were taken by Babylon, but whatever. Some people say it's later than that. After the period, most influential movement in the Orthodox Judaism extended well into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Pharisees preserved and transmitted Judaism through the flexibility given to the scriptural interpretation, etc. After the destruction of the Second Temple, fall of Jerusalem, it's really the Third Temple, but that's okay, it's Herod's Temple. In the synagogue and the schools of Pharisees that continue to function to promote Judaism through the diaspora. This is from the Encyclopedia. Not the Britannica, it's another encyclopedia. It's better than the Britannica, but they didn't have a good thing on Pharisees. Or yes, ma'am, on Sadducees.
But I think some of that may have been God's will, because all of the sacrifices were a picture of Jesus' sacrifice. He is the final Paschal lamb. And so sacrifice was no longer needed because Jesus was everyone's sacrifice. And so I think the temple of the destruction of the temple was God's will. And I think, and people who studied the word were preferred over people that just monitored, did you sacrifice right, did you bring the right thing,
Well, I think that what you say is really true, except there is a Thanksgiving sacrifice today.
Well, yeah, we have it. But,
We do it,
yeah,
right?
but it's not a blood sacrifice, it's not.
The blood sacrifice is done, right?
Right.
By Christ.
Right.
We'll learn more about that. That was Hebrews.
Right.
That's all Hebrews, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right on. So why do you think the Sadducees went to Teen Hodos?
There was
Job.
no good place.
Well, okay. You got a sliding scale here, right? On the bottom scale is all the bowling alleys were destroyed, so you can't be a bowler anymore, right? But on the top part of it is they were the ones connected to the sacrifice, right? And so who better than anyone else, suddenly when this Jesus guy comes and says, I'm the sacrifice, and you see the destruction of the temple, and they go, what are we going to do now? And a Teen Hodos guy gives them a tract. No. Peter comes and says, dude, Jesus was the Paschal Lamb. He was the sacrifice. And they go, right? Now the Pharisees...
Today, there's a book out called, I'm going to forget it. It's written by a Jew. But anyway, it's, I can't remember. Anyway, it's a second, what? Harbinger too, the return. And the author,
Uh-huh.
who is Jewish, comes to that conclusion, that Jesus Christ is the Paschal Lamb. And I thought, praise God, you know, it was wonderful. It ties everything that happened to America to the scripture. It's wonderful.
I think Pam was reading that, but, okay, last thought, because we're out of time. But the last thought, we'll get into the Essenes next. I know this a lot, but I want you to get some good information about these groups, because we've talked about them, but I want you to see the full-on information about them in a concise form. But the big deal is that even at the end of Judaism, we know what happened, right? The end of that century. Lots of Jews came to Teen Hodos. That's why it was so successful. You know, it went from, you know, small groups to one huge group that was Teen Hodos that were the lineage survivors, where the other, we know that lots of Jewish people came to Christ because they're Messianic, right? And even today we have Messianic Jews, but they're more rare because they come out of Judaism. Anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. Pray you look at this week, and you know we pray. Hope this wasn't too boring, but, you know, I
Not at all.
get the, I know it's hard getting into the good stuff, right? The translation is the most exciting part.
I heard a preacher giving a sermon talking about how